I chair the TSDAC and represent the Virginia Association of Counties. I'm a member of the James City County Board of Supervisors, and that's it. I'll now call on other members of TSDAC to introduce themselves, starting with the Vice Chair, Cindy Mester.
Good afternoon, everyone. Cindy Mester, work in the City Manager's Office, the City of Falls Church, and honored to represent VML on the TSDAC, and as the chair noted, served as vice chair.
Great. Dr. Smoot?
I'm Raymond Smoot, member of the Commonwealth Transportation Board.
Great. Thank you. Kate?
Good afternoon. I'm Kate Mattice. I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, and I'm proud to represent the Virginia Transit Association on TSDAC.
And Brian?
Good afternoon. I'm Brian Booth. I'm the Transit Director at Blacksburg Transit in the town of Blacksburg, and I am the representative for CTAB.
And Jamie?
Oh, this James. Hey, this
okay,
is James
I'm
Hudson.
sorry.
With
I'm
the
getting my
Association of
mic.
Counties.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jamie Jackson. I'm the Director of Transit and Transportation for Fredericksburg Regional Transit at the City of Fredericksburg. I represent DRPT.
And introduce Director Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tiffany Robinson, Director of the Department of Rail and Public Transportation.
Thank you. Anybody that I've missed?
Yes, good afternoon. My name's Noelle Pinkard. I'm the organization.
Oh, I'm sorry, Noelle. I didn't see.
No, it's fine. I'm with Hampton Roads Transit, and I also represent the Virginia Transit Association.
Great. So we do have a quorum, and Zach, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself and staff and our consultants. Or have them introduce themselves.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Yes. Good to see you all again. I look forward to some feedback today. Director to do so. I'm Zach Trogdon, Chief of Public Transportation. I have several of our staff here that have been working with you all on this. So I think in the interest of time, maybe we'll just get going. They may have to pipe up during questions or something, but yeah, I'm ready to go if y'all want to have the minutes this time, if y'all want to try to catch up on them as well. So just however you'd like to do it, sir.
All right. Well, we can go ahead and just have staff chime in when it's appropriate. We might want to just introduce our consultants. Nate.
Sure. We have with Kimberly Horn, Sarah Sherino, and then Nate Masick will be the main presenter on some of the operating, and Sam Sink, and then Sonica Seneth with us as our consultant team. So.
Great. Okay, we have as our next order of business the approval of the minutes of July 29th and August 27th, 2025 meetings. Does anyone have any amendments or corrections? I think Cindy, you had some corrections from an earlier the earlier set of minutes.
Yes, thank you. And that was for the July. So I just wanted to acknowledge and thank DRPT staff for updating the July minutes to incorporate some of my requests, which is why we deferred at the last meeting so that you could see sort of the dialogue besides the question, sort of what was the response and outcome. So I wanted to say thank you for that. I might suggest just for tracking purposes that today's version be labeled revised or version 2 or something so people could track the two versions since the other one was publicly released. And then the only other thought, which is mostly just formatting, is I noticed, and I didn't until I started really thinking about the format, the consultants aren't listed. So you got TSDAC members, staff, and then you don't see the consultants listed till you get into who's responding. I just thought for the public, now that we've gone back and put everything on the website, it would be helpful to flag who are the consultants. So with that, I just want to say thank you for revising the July meeting minutes. I don't have any comments to that, but also thank you, since I have the mic open, to DRPT staff for posting back to 2018 on the website.
Great. Okay. And so we should, I think, make sure that the minutes include reference to the consultants who are presenting today. and in our previous meeting. But with those changes, do I have a motion to approve the minutes of July and August?
Chair, could I request that they be voted on separately since I was
Sure.
absent on the July meeting?
Absolutely. So do I have a motion to approve the July minutes?
So moved.
Okay, moved and seconded. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed?
Sir, you would like
And
us to add that you would like us to add that, the consultant labeled in there as well. So we'll make that change.
Yes, right.
Pursuant to, okay, gotcha.
And,
Thank you.
abstentions.
I'll abstain since I was absent.
Great, okay. And have a motion to approve the August minutes.
So moved.
Okay, moved and
And if I
second.
would just ask that it also include the consultant's name as we did on July.
Yeah, I think that was already incorporated into it, but that's great. So any discussion? If not, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions? Okay, great. Now it's time to move on to the meat of the meeting, the presentation on review of the merit program. And I guess I'll turn that over to Nate. Unless anybody wants to give any preliminary remarks before we
Or to Director Robinson.
Mr. Chair, if it's okay, I think I'm gonna kick off our presentation with the intro
Great.
slides and then turn over to the consultants. This presentation will be a bit of a mix of DRPT and
Excellent.
our consultant team.
Thank you for.
Thanks, Nate. Thank you, Mr. Chair. With that, Nate, are you running slides? Perfect. Thank you. So we'll jump right in. And in order to be the most efficient with our time, we didn't think you needed yet another long presentation reviewing the entire formula today, yet again. But we do think it's important at this juncture to remind ourselves kind of our overarching policy goals, kind of the why we're doing this, along with an updated timeline and a reminder on roles and responsibilities in this process. And we also wanted to summarize the feedback we've received from you all thus far and kind of dive into that a little bit deeper by showing you some alternative scenarios based on the implementation of that feedback. So we'll get to that in the coming slides. And then finally, we want to share some internal analysis that this process has kind of encouraged us at DRPT to consider as well, essentially a revisiting of some of our DRPT internal definitions. And while this is a little bit outside the scope of the actual merit formula, in the spirit of full transparency, we just want to show this group some of those internal policy considerations alongside of this process, because we think it might have a slight impact on how the formula plays out. And so we want your feedback. So with that, we'll move to the next slide. And we're going to just do a quick review of our policy goals. So here's what I want to start with. I can fully understand, I've had a little bit more time to dive into all of the background information from the previous process in 2013-14 and in 2018. And I can fully understand why there was a need to spend so much time back then developing a formula from scratch that could somehow fairly allocate funding to 38 plus different transit agencies of different sizes, serving different populations with different service designs. It seems like an impossible task, and yet now we have merit. But over the years, and with data stabilizing after the pandemic, the question that we're really here for today is whether or not merit is doing exactly what it stands for. Is it making efficient and responsible investments in transit? And all of the policy goals presented during this review process have specifically been designed to address some of the drawbacks that we have seen with the current formula. So first, we want to address the complexity of the formula. I think every single member agreed in the beginning of this process that the need for some simplicity and transparency was paramount. And staff has shared how the trends create anomalies and allocations where good performance has not always been rewarded as it should be. And second, since the General Assembly reminded us in 2018 that they wanted the entire formula to be performance-based, we really want to make sure we're focusing on outputs more than inputs. And while sizing here, even in our proposed changes, still includes a significant operating cost consideration, adding a secondary performance process that is completely decoupled from the sizing prevents the redistribution of funds over and over again that was essentially diluting any performance boost previously. And third, I can't emphasize enough that we don't control the amount of funding available, but with growing needs and scarce resources, we really believe it's our duty to ensure that we're incentivizing cost efficiency in order to make sure these dollars are reaching as many customers as possible. So with that, I would just ask all members to keep in mind that we're here to evaluate the overarching public policy goals and not necessarily the individual outcomes of any particular agency. As you know, there are multiple variables that will come into play each year. And we've shown you some of that in the volatility of the formula in past years. We never know exactly what revenues we're going to receive, and the data collected is always a little bit different. And for an FY28 grant year, remember, we will be using FY26 data. So that will look very different, especially for some agencies looking at the data from this past year than the historical data that we're using in our scenarios. So with all of that in mind, I want to also, let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the timeline. We're going to talk about next steps again at the end of this presentation, but I did want to discuss our timeline up front because it's changed a little bit from when we started. I was actually hoping to be in a place today where we might be in a position for the TSDAC to take a formal vote or position on a proposal. However, considering that we are going to introduce some alternate options for you today based on feedback heard, and we realize that you may need a little bit more time to digest this information before forming your individual positions. So you can see on the left side of this slide, we've just summarized the 6 TSDAC meetings and all the September additional meetings that we've had with stakeholders thus far. And then the right side summarizes our next steps, starting today with today's meeting. And in order to stay on track, we will be starting a 45-day public comment period tomorrow, seeking comment on 2 proposals, which we're going to discuss and show you later in this presentation. And in the meantime, the one thing that did not make it into this slide, but that we are planning for late October in response to some of the stakeholder meetings we've had is a webinar in late October. We're going to make this open to the public and to all transit agencies just to provide one additional comprehensive opportunity to explain the current formula, its drawbacks, and the proposed improvements and changes, as well as giving everyone another opportunity to answer any questions that are still out there. We know this is very complex, and we realize that a similar webinar was held back during the 2018 process. So we thought that even though we've taken every single meeting that has been requested, we think this will be another helpful step to present kind of a final product of the from and the to, and take questions from everybody all at once. And we will be seeking feedback from you today after this presentation as to whether or not you would prefer to schedule another meeting at the very end of the public comment period, which would be ending November 21st, or if you may wish to go ahead and schedule a meeting possibly in late October after the webinar to come back together to take a position on the 2 versions of this proposal. So stay tuned, more to come. We'll talk about that at the end. And finally, since we have heard so many comments about the process, I did just want to highlight the massive difference between this review process based on lessons learned over the past several years of administering this formula and the process that this group undertook back originally in 2013 to develop this very complex methodology from scratch. That was obviously very different than the tweaks we're proposing now. And what we're doing is a little more similar to the process from 2018 after the General Assembly required the formula to be 100% performance-based. And we know that those TSDAC meetings also began in March and ended in December. But even that was more complex work than this 3-year review that we are undertaking in order to essentially fix or address some issues that have presented themselves over the past several years. And where we believe the formula is not working as intended and could be tweaked, that's kind of the process that we're undergoing in this review, where we just want to make sure that we are rewarding good performance and effective, efficient management, and and looking and just focusing on that as we move forward. So the next slide, Nate, we can keep going. We had a couple questions about this in some of our smaller stakeholder meetings. So we thought we would just review this one more time before we dive into the details. In terms of roles and responsibilities, it's the code clearly offers for the role of CTV to set priority and adopt the policies for implementation of the merit operating formula and the capital prioritization process. The TSDAC is identified as the group that should consult with DRPT and stakeholders to develop formula concepts and to advise on merit operating assistance policy improvement. And then Department of Rail and Public Transportation. We are the organization that develops the technical guidance and the definitions for implementation of the merit operating formula. We run the formula annually, analyze the outcomes, and recommend changes to both operating and capital as needed. So next slide. I talked a little bit earlier about all the feedback we have
Chair
received.
and Dr. Robinson, I
Sure.
wonder before we jump in that, could I just make 2 points, Chair?
Oh, sure. This be appropriate place to do that, I think. Sure.
It feels like, yeah, we were about to start changing topics. So one, and it may be that you can bring it back, but on the slide 5, which is the schedule, and maybe Zach, you can bring this in later. I just wanted to flag the chronology that you prepared for me so I would understand sort of like the workflow between now and FY28 and why we need that January 2026 date target. So I don't know if you want to do that now or later. I just wanted to flag that because that was helpful information for me. And thank you for sending it to TSDAC. And then on the next slide, which is our roles, I totally agree with that layout, but for the TSDAC summary, which I realize we're summarizing state code, for me, it understated sort of the role of TSDAC, because when you actually look at the state code, there's a couple shalls in there. And so the chair shall advise and there shall be recommendation, which means the advising is more than just, as I would translate that in a local government world with a board of commissions, let's say our Environmental Sustainability Council. They're literally advising council, but in this case, we have state code that created TSDAC, were to advise, and if the chair shall be presenting, I think the chair needs to have the backing of the TSDAC behind him to speak on our behalf. So while I don't disagree with the concept, I just felt like it was slightly understated for what our role in this process is. So thank you, Chair, for letting me have those 2 points right now.
Okay, so we'll put a pin on those 2 items.
Thank you, Cindy. It's interesting. I want to address quickly your comments so that I don't forget them later in the presentation, but it's interesting how the code is a little bit more specific for TSDAC's role for the original development of the formula, and a little bit more vague when it comes to any kind of redefining during a review process going forward. So you're right, we did our best to summarize that, but thank you for those really important points. And I hope Zach can weigh in when I'm done. I hope he might have shared kind of the chronology that you had asked for with all the members, so everyone had access to that. And he can probably lay it out better than I can, but you're absolutely right. It is a tricky timeline. The summer months are the one time of the year when DRPT staff has a little bit of flexibility to work on projects like this. And as we move towards the holidays, the team is already developing the workshops and the webinars for our upcoming grant round that will kick off later in the year. And then obviously we're preparing for legislative session, but February 1, December through February, our grantees are working with our staff for technical assistance to submit their applications. And then when February 1 hits, it's all hands on deck in our department, as you might imagine, to score and allocate funding before the budget process of the 6-year improvement plan goes to CTV. And we have public hearings all across the Commonwealth in May and April. So, and then that brings us back to kind of the time frame that we started this process. So it is a really busy time frame. And we just want to make sure that all of the work gets done in time for our team to revise applications, prepare new workshops. So we have ample time to educate and provide technical assistance to all of our grantees about any upcoming changes for a future fiscal year's application. Zach, did I miss anything?
Sorry, no, I think at the high level, that's exactly it. It's just, yeah, we're going to start the fiscal year 27 process here very soon. And so the same goes for 1 year from now when we're in 28 with these changes. There's going to be some additional work that goes into making sure that those are communicated correctly. So that's just where, yeah, it seems like it's far off, but in a year from now, we'll be implementing these changes, as that goes. So that's, yeah. So Cindy, if you would like to give me to give any examples of what we're doing during that time, I will. If you feel like the public wants to know that, or whether the members want to hear anything else, if this is the time.
Yeah, I'm sure somebody may have questions, but maybe since we do have public comment coming up and other people, we could just put that timeline in the chat, because that was very helpful to break out why we're doing FY28 funding now.
Okay.
I don't have any other questions right now.
And it wasn't perfect. Even some staff might be able to add a little more color to it too, since they're up to their elbows in it too. So we can certainly flesh that out if you like during the meeting. So thank you. I'll stick something in the chat.
Okay, I think it would be helpful though for the committee to hear those comments, Zach.
Thank you.
Such as, yeah.
Mr. Chair, did you want him to go ahead and put all that in the chat, or you want him to speak additionally to it?
Yeah, I'm not sure how likely people are going to flip back and forth between the chat and the presentation.
Yeah, well, let me give just the basic outline here we had worked out. So again, around this time of year is when we really start in earnest on preparation for applications. And we even have October 1st, a pre-application period opened up for major expansion projects. And then then December 1st is when the application round actually opens. And so through February, we're taking applications, we're talking with grantees, and a lot of communication back and forth. So February 1st, as Director Robertson mentioned, from then until, so we get in applications, hundreds of them a year, and we start to score them. It's spread out amongst all our staff. Everybody's all hands on deck. And so from February 1st to mid to sort of late March, it's all applications and scoring. And so we have to have the draft 6-year improvement program done by mid-March to really get it ready for a presentation to the CTB in April, or at least giving them the draft 6-year improvement plan in April. And so that's, you can tell it just from February 1st till, it's only about 8 to 10 weeks. We have to do all of that, basically try to get the SIP where it needs to be. And so from mid-April, when it's given to the CTB in draft form, then there's public hearings that we attend, and we're making revisions to the 6-year improvement program from mid-March until basically until through May and June, when it then is finalized and given to the CTB to adopt. So in 26, it'll be for fiscal year 27. So then in June of 27 will be 28. So that's where we start in the fall. We're going to start in the fall of 26. And during, again, as Director Robinson was alluding to, once we start the process, also when we're preparing for application period, we're giving out guidance. We're talking with grantees about what's changed in the program, giving technical guidance. And so that's all happening during the fall as well. Between the summer and fall, we're having workshops and getting guidance together. So I know that's kind of jumbled, but that's the gist of it. So I was telling Cindy, I was joking with her, it's kind of how her budget process now just there used to be a break, but it never ends now. It doesn't seem.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, Zach.
Okay.
Okay, we'll jump back in. Let's go to the feedback slide, please, Nate. So we just wanted to kind of put out the reminder that we've obviously heard a ton of feedback during several public meetings, as well as during several smaller meetings with both members and stakeholders. And there have been some suggestions and concerns and requests that we've heard over and over again. So we want to make sure everyone knows that we heard you, and we want to present our responses and even some alternatives to how we might approach things slightly differently, specifically to address your feedback. So I think the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah from our consultant team to specifically walk through the capital assistance proposals based on this feedback. And then I'll jump back in to discuss the operating assistance feedback. Sarah?
Thanks, Director Robertson. As we mentioned, there was a lot of opportunities for feedback throughout this process, and I'll talk about the capital side of things. On capital, there was 4 major categories of proposed changes. Those came down to developing additional subcategories for project types. That was things like for state of good repair, breaking out state of good repair into projects that had an asset condition score versus projects that did not have an asset condition score. And that really came down to some project types do not have that useful life and cannot be scored in the same methodology. Similarly, on the major side of things, separating major expansion projects from major state of good repair projects, recognizing that those 2 project types are different in their intention and should be scored differently. On those categories, we didn't receive any major concerns with formalizing, in many cases, what are existing DRPT scoring processes. The second item was scoring all vehicle expansion projects under the MIN category. Currently, expansion projects that have 5 vehicles or less than 5% of the fleet are scored as MIN, where projects with greater than 5 vehicles or 5% of the fleet are scored as major. And those have different match percentages. So to simplify things, scoring everything under MIN made a lot of sense. And we received consensus that this does simplify the process and it allows for that same match ratio. The third item was restructuring the incentive points, and this is probably where we spent most of our time. We talked about removing the incentive point categories for 3 items: zero emissions technology, innovation, and safety and comfort, and then adding in incentive points for good grants management. And those were project progress, so showing that action is being taken on grant funding, and then project closeout, incentivizing agencies to make sure projects are closed out in a timely fashion. On this one, we heard from you that if those incentive point categories aren't producing the desired results, it may make sense to remove them. Probably the biggest sticking point we heard was on the project progress. Some really good points about the fact that vehicle procurements may not result in agencies having an invoice within that 2-year period for project progress. We thought that was really good feedback and understanding that that doesn't necessarily mean an agency isn't moving forward with the project. It may just be due to the procurement cycle. And then finally, we talked about switching to a biennial application cycle for major projects. And some feedback on that was the needing to consider alignment with other funding cycles. And then also some feedback that potentially not having applications every year could cause a loss of momentum with some other funding partners. Next slide. So based on that feedback, a couple of modifications were made. In terms of that project progress, DRPT is going to look into how to include some exemptions to internal processes to make sure that reasons outside of an agency's control, like the procurement of vehicles, wouldn't impact a progress incentive points. And then DRPT is also going to retain that annual cycle for merit capital assistance projects. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nate for operating.
I think I'm going to jump back in, Sarah, and just talk about the feedback and then turn it over to Nate to go over the numbers because he's definitely better equipped to do that than me. So regarding the feedback on operating assistance, we talked about some things that we heard over and over again. And one of the main pieces of feedback we have received was a concern in the performance side of the calculation with including only 1 year of data. There has been a lot of concern and questions about what would happen if there were a catastrophic event in 1 year and how would that potentially impact performance if we were using 1 year of data on that side of the allocation. So that's one area of feedback we're going to address today. The second area that we've heard a lot about is a concern that commuter bus operators may be significantly more impacted than other services. I think everybody knows that commuter bus riders, oftentimes they board once, they ride for 20 to 50 miles, but each rider is only counted once in the metrics. So passenger miles traveled would be more favorable to commuter bus modes, but we don't have reliable data for all agencies on that yet. So I'll talk about that again in a minute. And we are also looking, let's see, we're going to analyze that a little bit closer. We've also heard a little bit more detail about the concern with the way that the deadhead miles and hours are counted for commuter bus operators. In order to make up for the disadvantage in the ridership sizing metric, we've historically allowed commuter bus routes agencies to provide unidirectional and over 20 miles in length deadhead miles that count as their hours and revenue miles for those routes in the sizing portion of the. And this will continue with the new proposed approach. However, since we're moving to a performance-based allocation based on a comparison of direct metrics and not trends, increasing hours and miles by deadhead in the formula would actually disadvantage commuter bus routes in that portion of the formula. So we're taking a little bit closer look at that as well. And the third thing we heard a lot about was simply the need for additional data. And we couldn't agree more. We are in the process of drafting a scope of work so that we can get really solid feedback and guidance in the form of a study on the available data that is out there, or what data we would need to better calculate cost by mode, for example, and passenger miles traveled, and assess best practices for collecting this data. So that's all good news directly from your feedback. Let's see. Did we switch slides? So in the next slide, we're just looking at kind of our responses to that feedback. We definitely are evaluating the pros and cons of the 1 year versus the 3-year averages in our performance calculation. And you're going to see that in what Nate's going to present to you next. We're also conducting some additional analysis, as I mentioned in my intro, of kind of our internal policy definitions to see if that makes an impact on operating cost assumptions for sizing, or the impact of deadhead miles and hours for commuter bus on sizing and performance. And then, like I said, we're working on the scope of work to do a study because we heard you, and eventually in the future we would like to move toward the ability to do this review again and tweak the formula in with all the data that we need to make better, more informed decisions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nate to start talking about the alternatives and the numbers, kind of the implementation of some of this feedback. Nate, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thank you very much. And so we're going to delve into some of these assumptions now and scenarios and really alternative scenarios that we've developed in response to the feedback that we've received. There's a total of 4 alternatives we'll be presenting all together, and we're going to start with this one first, which is alternative A. The key difference here is that it uses a 3-year average to compute the performance adjustment portion of the formula, as opposed to just using a single point in time data point for a single year. So I want to be real clear about the numbers that we're presenting here, which is consistent with what we've presented previously. These are average results over a 3-year period. So that's one type of 3-year average that's incorporated here. But there's a second type of 3-year average that this also incorporates, which is that we're using 3 years of performance data in the performance portion of the analysis. So two different types of 3-year averaging in order to present the results that are here. The reason we do the first type to show results over a 3-year period is because we want to try to inform the decision by using multiple years worth of data, because there is fluctuation in the services operated and the resulting data points from year to year, from agency to agency. So we look at results for 24, 25, and 26 compared to actuals for that time frame, And then we also, as part of this analysis, we're looking specifically at what if we use a 3-year average for the performance portion rather than just a single year's worth of data. So to comprise the FY26 estimate of funding by agency, this new alternative uses data from 24, 25, and 26 to make that performance adjustment. I see we might have a question here. And Mr. Chair, would it be your preference to take those questions as we go from the board members?
Yeah, I think that would probably be most efficient.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Nate. I actually have so kind of a step back question just to understand. Obviously, the performance adjustment occurs for those systems who've already not received a cap of 30% in any given year. Just either it's a percentage or what's in general, how many systems have already maxed their 30% and would actually be playing in this space versus those who haven't, just to give a sense of sort of, because my sense is not everybody would be able to get the benefit of a performance adjustment.
Yeah, so it's about 3 or 4 agencies from year to year who tend to cap out and get the full 30% from that. And you can see on here that there are several agencies where the dollar difference is 0.
Thank you.
Those are agencies that are effectively capping out at 30%. So with these particular numbers, it's Blacksburg, Harrisonburg, and Blackstone.
Okay, thanks for pointing that out, just because I know some would not play in this, others would. So I appreciate you clarifying that.
Yep, happy to clarify. Let me just talk to the table and what you're seeing in terms of the columns in the table here. So you'll see the same table for all the alternatives that we'll present this afternoon. So we start with, of course, the names of the grantees in the leftmost column. Then the next column over from that is how much the average allocation has been for each of these agencies over the 3-year period, FY24, 25, and 26. So this is their average allocation under the current formula. Then the next pair of columns over is the results for the sizing plus performance adjustment scenario, which is the approach that we presented at the last 2 TSDAC meetings. So these are the same results that we presented at those last 2 meetings. And we've tried to color those results to show the agencies that are receiving greater or less than $500,000 or greater or less than 5% of their current allocation, which is highlighted in red or green. So green if they went up by more than those thresholds, red or pink if it went down by more than those thresholds. So that previous alternative that we looked at is the middle columns of this table, and you can see the difference in terms of the dollar amount and the percentage amount relative to what the agency would have originally received under that approach. And then you can see with this adjustment we're making for this particular alternative to use 3 years of a 3-year average of data in the performance adjustment, that's shown in the right 2 columns. So the dollar difference and the percentage difference for that particular alternative is in the rightmost column. In each case, we're comparing the results to what the agency actually received, the average of what the agencies actually received in 24, 25, and 26. So by eyeing the differences between the middle columns and the rightmost columns, you can see the incremental effect that making this change would have on most agencies. So we do have some animation that helps to, actually, maybe we don't for this one. What I'll note for this scenario, we do for some of the other scenarios that we'll present, that the result of doing this particular change is relatively small on what the agencies receive in most cases, in part because we're only really adjusting how much agencies would get in the performance portion of the allocation, which is about 5% of the funds that are being allocated. And therefore, these results don't create a whole significant change in what agencies receive, which we can see graphically in the next slide. So this is showing the quadrant graphs, which show the results and how they differ by agency between the two scenarios that we presented. So what you see in the darker blue or black dots on this table is what an agency would have received under the scenarios that we presented last time and how that differs from what they actually received. And then the orange dots represent how their allocation would change with this tweak to performance to use a 3-year average rather than just a single year's worth of data. So the impact of that is shown in pairs, and you can see that some agencies go up. So for example, to take this example in the upper right corner of the table, you can see GLTC Lynchburg grows and goes from about 13% to about 15% change from what they would have received under the existing approach. You can also see in the other quadrant how Fairfax Connector gains about $200,000 with this single change. So in percentage terms, it doesn't change the percentage allocation for Fairfax Connector that much, possibly going from about gain of about 6 to 7%, or a decline. Sorry, let me be clear: a decline of 6 to 7%. Due in part to the fact that Fairfax Connector receives a very significant amount of funding through this formula, and therefore this dollar change is not as significant of a percentage change for that particular agency. So I do see a question on the table, so let me go to Vice Chair Mester first, and then I think this would be a good time to answer any other clarifying questions we have about the scenario and what the graphs show before we move along.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. It is just a clarifying question. It would be for this slide prior with the chart. So if I'm interpreting this right, while the percentage may have changed or a dollar may have changed, no local operators, red or green, changed. Because they seem to be the same in both 3-year or single year, right? So nobody was added, deleted in each year. Each scenario, they stayed green or they stayed red.
Right, that's right.
Okay.
With this particular scenario.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to clarify I was reading it correctly.
And to make one other point in terms of just keep in mind with respect to the next graph that we show on the next slide, we're comparing everything to how the numbers appear in that current formula tab column of the table. The results that are in the middle column of this table are what the black dots in that graph represent, and the rightmost columns are what the orange dots represent. Just to make the link between these tables and the graphs clear. All right, any questions about this before we move to the next slide?
So just to make this clear to me, we've got a very small number of companies that are moving in the negative direction, but by a larger amount, and most seem to be gaining if they're changing, but by smaller percentages, smaller dollar amounts maybe.
Yeah, and I think the noticeable trend here is that those that did better using this approach, who are in the upper quadrant, tend to be moving from the direction where you move from black to orange is in a positive direction with this change. So these agencies that were doing better under this formula continue to do better. So HRT moves to the right, GRTC Richmond moved to the right, Lynchburg, Valley Metro, all are sort of improving what they get. We do see Arlington County drops a little bit, a very, very small amount. Of the ones that were the major movers, according to the previous result. Those that didn't fare as well under this particular allocation approach tended not to do as well. When you use a 3-year average, their results tended to drop. And you can see how you move from the black, it's a downward direction from the black to the orange in this lower quadrant.
Okay, thank you.
So I want to talk, continuing on this same topic, I want to talk about some of the trends and factors just to compare how these results vary between the 1 year versus the 3 years of performance data. So when we're looking at the 1 year performance data scenario, we see some of the pros and cons of that on the left, some in the 3 year on the right. And we've tried to shade these in pink to indicate where it's more of a con for that particular approach, green where it's more of a pro for that approach. We've used white where there doesn't seem to be any clear advantage for one approach versus the other. So starting at the top, one of the comments we heard through several of our meetings were, what if there's a catastrophic impact, and what if that impacts the data that, the use of data that would be used for my allocation. So an agency suffers some sort of situation that causes their service to drop, their operating expenditures to drop, and other ridership to drop, other factors that could cause them to have an extreme impact on how much grant funding they would receive because of how this formula functions. One point we want to make with respect to that is that the sizing metric is currently using 1 year's worth of data to allocate funds, and under the proposed approach would continue to use 1 year's worth of data to allocate funds. So the impact of that catastrophic event is really the same under, at least on sizing, which is what under this new formula would be used to allocate 95% of the funds. That would be the same impact generally under both scenarios, that neither for the purposes of sizing is accounting for that 1 year impact, because both are using just 1 year worth of data. Taking a look at the next impact on the next row of this table, there's a more significant impact of a catastrophic event on the 5% performance allocation when we're just using a single year. So that is one thing that using a single year's worth of data, you would have more of an impact of that catastrophic event on your performance allocation if you move to a 1 year use of data versus 3 year average. Using a 3 year average, it does smooth the impact of that 1 year of the catastrophic event, but only for the performance allocation portion of the calculation. So that's the 5% portion of the allocation that could be smoothed somewhat by using 3 years of performance data. When we look at some other outcomes of this, though, the results flip, and in our opinion, the 1 year performance data scenario benefits from that approach, in that the fact that the catastrophic event impacts performance allocation calculation for only 1 year is a fact that you're only going to get that one-time hit once if you're only using 1 year's worth of data in that calculation. And as your service presumably starts to recover by the next year, you're not continuing to average that poor year in for 2 more years of allocations. So there's some advantage to taking the quick hit and being done with it, and then having it be averaged into your results for the performance allocation for 2 more years. The other thing is that the 1 year data scenario rewards improved performance due to strategic changes in service. So to the extent that you make changes in your service patterns that help to improve your performance according to the factors that are used for performance allocation, you see the benefit of that in the year in which that data is applied. So if you were to make changes to your service in 26, you would see that within your next year of funding for FY 28. So there is a little bit of a lag in terms of when the data is applied and when it results in your formula, because your formula allocations are generally based on being 2 years later. But there's a more direct tie between those changes and what you eventually receive in funds than when the funds are being averaged with other years, which kind of dilutes the impact of the changes you may be trying to make to improve your performance. let me pause right there just to see if there's any questions about these pros or cons before we say want to bring up one other fact before I turn it over to questions real quick, which is that we did find that using a 3-year average to calculate performance did not address the significantly larger impact of the same single year metrics on sizing. So, sizing has the lion's share of the impact on what agencies are receiving, and therefore this change didn't result in a whole lot of changes in what agencies are receiving. And then that the small benefit of smoothing out negative years by using 3-year rolling averages is countered by the disbenefits that we noted with respect to seeing the benefits more quickly, as well as this adds some administrative complexity, because then the formula is based on 3 years worth of data rather than 1 year. So you're kind of, continuing to use older data as a basis for making future allocations.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions for Nate on what he's presented so far?
Okay, so we'll keep rolling then with a couple of other administrative, a couple of other analyses that we did, which looked at how some administrative policy changes that are within DRPT's domain to make changes in policy and definitions that could impact allocations, how those might pencil out. So the 3 alternatives that we're looking at here, similar to the alternative that I just presented, these pivot off of the approach, the revised approach that was presented at the last 2 TSDAC meetings, and the alternatives make tweaks to that approach in order to measure the impact on allocations. So alternative B makes a change in which it excludes commuter bus deadhead miles from the performance portion of the allocation. So the reason we would do that is because in this revised formula approach, when you add those deadhead miles to the formula, it helps you on the sizing side. And the reason for including deadhead for commuter bus routes, or the way it's defined, is routes greater than 20 miles in length, which entail a significant amount of deadhead because you have these buses and sort of running from suburban and exurban areas into the central city, and most prominently probably into Washington D.C., and then running deadhead back to pick up more passengers and then come back into the central city again. There are examples of commuter bus routes in other regions of the state as well, but that's probably the best example of it. When we take those deadhead miles into account for sizing, it helps those commuter bus agencies because it adds to their sizing calculation. And that was a deliberate change that was made back in 2018 to reflect the unique structure and costs associated with that type of operation. However, when deadhead is added to the performance calculation and we're dividing by the number of miles and hours that those agencies are operating, it hurts the commuter buses because then there's a larger denominator that's being used to divide their ridership over. So we wanted to see what would be the impact if we took that those extra miles that we were adding on the sizing side and the performance side. What if we took those miles out on just the performance side, so that we could see how that impacts what agencies receive as a result? Alternative C takes into account the costs that are applied for the purposes of sizing. So currently, when sizing is computed for the performance cost data, what's used is that the performance cost data takes into account all of the costs that an agency operates with, so that there's a larger cost that's being counted as part of the performance calculation, because there's a portion of costs that's excluded for the purposes of sizing. And for the purposes of sizing, DRPT is excluding costs that are subsidized services or grant funded services, so that there isn't the theory behind that was that you were kind of double dipping in some ways, because services that were being grant funded were then also being included in the grant sizing amount, so that there would be grant funding collected on top of that. So for the purposes of doing the sizing calculation, those costs are excluded from sizing currently. So the switch would be to, instead of excluding those costs from sizing, you'd be including them in the same way that they're being included for the performance portion of the calculation. That would increase the cost for agencies that have a significant amount of reimbursed services, such as some of the commuter bus routes that are funded through different funding sources, and increase their sizing in the process, so that they would get more funds through the sizing formula, because you wouldn't be excluding these costs from the sizing portion of the calculation. Let me just pause to see if there are any questions about that before we move on. Member Matthijs.
Thank you, Nate, and Mr. Chair, and thanks, Nate. And I truly am going to try and get my brain around this. I know there are systems that operate, whether they even get money from a university. And so that's really what I'm getting at, is that looking at the revenue sources that are funding our transit system, as long as we're looking at them most holistically, I just want to make sure that it's, because I think that, the budget, the cost of operating a system is then there's different revenues that people are getting in from different places, whether a university is sponsoring service or whatever. So can you just really clearly, you've talked about commuter bus, but when it comes to, I think all of our services are very creative in the way that they identify revenue to help pay for them. Are we planning to treat those all equally? And if you said that already, I'm sorry. I'm literally, I'm trying to catch up and understand this.
So for the purposes of what we're looking at here, this only impacts what's funded by the state. That's the only thing that's considered with respect to the existing policy in terms of what's excluded, is that portions of services that are funded by the state are excluded administratively from the costs that are considered for sizing, under this theory that it would be a double subsidy by the state, because you have these projects that are being funded by the state that then increase your sizing and create more funding from the state. This does not take into account any funding sources beyond what the state funds to pay for these services. So I think you raise an interesting point, but it's not something that's considered within the scope of either what's currently being done or what's being looked at for a potential change with this particular alternative.
And so, Mr. Chair, if I could indulge, I just want to see if I can follow up. So only those services that are specifically, there's a grant from DRPT that goes to them. I was just like, what's sort of defined as state? And partially is that NVTC has an agreement with the state to get toll revenues, of which we fund competitive services through that. Is that considered state funding? Or only those things that get direct grant from DRPT? Like, are our systems actually penalized for getting commuter choice money? God, I hope not.
Tiffany, do you want to chime in, or we have a.
And if that's an offline conversation, because I know it's very geographic specific, I'm happy to take it offline. Yeah. I just had a moment thinking, I thought a transit systems budget was a transit system budget. And if they got creative in funding everything else from different sources, we should applaud them for their creativity.
Yeah, there's been instances if a DRPT program was funding something that's kind of understandable, that we may not want to, also. So it's all about allowing it as part of operating costs, which go into the sizing metric. And so if a DRPT program was funding it, it would seem like it may not be right. However, we're looking to incentivize people to expand service and such. So there are instances we're looking at in terms of the demo program, some trip programs, and then also there's things out there like IOEP and things like that, that we're kind of looking at whether those funds, could be kept in there in terms of operating costs that goes into the sizing metrics. So that's been a discussion we've been having. That makes sense. Like you said, there's these other funding sources maybe didn't even exist a few years ago that we're looking at as they're public funds, but not necessarily they're not there. Some of them are DRPT programs, some of them are other programs. Chair, I'm not going to take over your meeting. Somebody else has their hand up from the staff. So
Okay.
to recognize them.
Yeah, I don't know, Dan, if there was something you wanted to add on behalf of staff there.
Sure. Kate, I think you characterized what we are aiming at here with this change correctly, is that essentially anything that comes through the 6-year improvement program as a state-funded project was being removed in the sizing metric until now.
Okay, so it was
Okay.
before, and this change proposed would look at everything holistically.
And I think that's the key that needs to be restated now, is that some of these programs like the I-66 toll money, the 95 toll money, if there was projects that were being funded through those, though they were being reduced from the sizing metric prior to today. And we are proposing something here that kind of goes against the theory that we had approached it from before. It was seen as kind of avoiding double dipping on those projects, when in reality, this is really a sizing metric to set how big an agency is. And so we are recognizing that with this proposal.
And if I could thank you for that clarification, I think that is fantastic, considering there's state aid that's helping a lot of our transit systems, but they may not be DRPT funded. It's really nice to know that we might look holistically. This is a wonderful, positive part of the conversation. So I'm glad I asked the question. And thank you, Nate, for explaining it.
Okay, any other questions that people have at this point?
I see hands up for Brian Booth and
and
Director Robinson.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think I'll just clarification to tag on to Kate. And just a question I have is, for those state-sponsored services that were getting state funds that were previously excluded, was the performance metrics like ridership and passengers per mile segregated out as well in the past, or were they left into the total calculation for the performance?
I can take a crack at this one, or Nate, if you'd like to.
Go ahead, Dan.
Okay. So if you all recall, and we haven't gone over definitions in quite some time, in the operating formula, there are 2 different metrics for sizing. There's, for cost. There's cost for sizing and cost for performance. And so in the cost sizing, we were reducing out the totals for a few different programs that would essentially lower those amounts in the sizing metric. But on the performance side, we were including the fully loaded performance metrics of hours, miles, and ridership, and the fully loaded cost of everything.
Okay.
Okay, so including the ridership, hours, and miles of those projects that were funded through those programs. And I will say the hours, miles, and ridership were also included on the sizing side.
So essentially, this change would mean that everything's included all the time.
Exactly. It's a simplification. And yes, exactly.
Okay, I think that makes sense, because it makes it cleaner, because you're not excluding one piece of the cost, but yet you're still including the performance related to it. So I think it creates consistency. Thank you.
Okay, other questions, comments?
Mr. Chair, may I weigh in really briefly?
Of course, of course.
To Brian and Kate's points, Brian actually took the words out of my mouth, because I did just want to jump in to add that this not only seems logical, but it also simplifies things for our grantees' understanding, and it simplifies internal calculations for our transit and finance team as well, to be consistent and use the full picture. Sometimes I kind of take all the technical expertise from my staff and I have to step back, to a little bit higher level of understanding and say, okay, does this mean we're actually incentivizing our agencies to go after all different kinds of funds? And we would never penalize them. We want to really look at the full picture of their operating costs with everything included, because that really is a better picture of their size. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. And so sometimes when you reframe it, I do it for my own brain, and I thought that might be helpful, but I think Brian and Kate also hit on those points. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments?
Mr. Chair again, and
Kate?
thank you, Director Robinson. This actually, I would say, is a perfect example of, if this has been in place for years, folks didn't understand. Even though we had a lot of time going through this in 2018 and a little bit of revision, just shows you how complicated this is, and having the time to explain can add incredible value. Many of us are sitting here and did not know anything about this previous policy. So the fact that we're taking the time and able to do that is, I think, is fantastic. But it just shows how incredibly complicated this is when, if this has been in place for 4 years or 5 or 6, whatever, our systems did not actually understand that. And yet they were making policy decisions and budget decisions that may or may not have affected this. So it just kind of adds to the fact of the length and breadth of explanation is really, really important when we're talking about the bottom line on how this funding's allocated. So thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other hands, but that's
Okay.
not surprising. Mhm.
Well, I will continue
Ready to
then.
move on?
I will continue just to note very simply that alternative D is really all of the above. It takes all of the changes that we talked about, including the one that we've stepped through the graph for already, and then alternatives B and C on this page, and applies all 3 of those changes all at once as a combined package of changes. So we'll look at how all of these work in conjunction with each other in alternative D. So I'm going to move now to the results of these alternatives that I just explained. So this first one is alternative B, which excludes the commuter bus deadhead from the performance portion of the allocation. And in other words, it makes the data that's being used for the performance portion of the allocation consistent with what's being used for other agencies, which is that it's the revenue hours and revenue miles, and not including any deadhead for commuter bus. In this case here, to orient you to the table, the results that you're seeing in the first and the left are identical to what we were looking at before. The results in the middle of the table are the same results that we've been looking at all along with respect to the previous 2 meetings, and those are the results of the sizing plus performance scenario that we presented before. So those numbers don't change. What does change is the rightmost column, which shows the results with this tweak to the treatment of commuter bus deadhead in the performance portion of the allocation. And you can see how the agencies change. I will, flag, for example, that actually we have some additional text that helps to clarify this, which is that in most cases, this doesn't change how much agencies receive to a significant extent. And that's in part because this is limited to the performance portion of the allocation, which is 5% versus the 95% that we allocate via sizing. So all in all, it doesn't change things significantly for most agencies. The numbers do change for everybody a little bit here, except for those that were already capping out at 30%, because you change one number, you change every number in a zero-sum game like this. You will note that there are a couple of changes here. So PRTC, for example, its amount of funding that it would not get under this new approach is a little bit less. So it would have gotten 750,000 less, and with this approach, it gets about 650,000 less. There's also a slight decrease in the amount of money that Hampton Roads Transit would get. It still gains under this scenario, but it doesn't gain quite as much. Its gains go from 507 down to about 468,000. So it gains, but not quite as much in this particular scenario. Most of the other agencies, the changes are fairly limited. And that's in part because most other agencies don't have significant amounts of commuter bus deadhead that's being taken out of the calculation. Okay, so those are we would generally categorize these changes as relatively small on a statewide basis, but there are some impacts for a couple of agencies of note.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go to alternative C next, unless there are questions about B.
Any hands? Not seeing anyone.
Okay, so we'll go to C next. So this is the one that applies the total cost of operation, the total cost for sizing. So it addresses that lets the costs, all of the costs that an agency incurs count for the purposes of sizing. What we see here with this scenario is that on a statewide basis, again, it doesn't have a huge impact on how much agencies get, because most agencies costs are not being adjusted to have costs taken out. It's very few agencies with subsidized services or subsidized programs, grant-funded programs, that are being excluded from the sizing calculation at present. So by and large, this doesn't change things for most agencies, and you can see that the results from the middle columns to the right most columns don't change all that much for most agencies. There are some notable improvements. So Fredericksburg, for example, its change in funding is a decline of 6% as opposed to 7% before. So it still declines, but not quite as much as it previously did. We do see some improvement for PRTC. It's with this change, its allocation, its decline in funding was about 750,000 before. With this change, its decline would be about 350,000. So there's about a $300,000 improvement in what PRTC would receive via this change. We also interestingly see a change for Central Shenandoah PDC, because it would gain about 21% in funding, in part because they had a plan that was funded by DRPT within the range of years that we were looking at, and the cost of doing that strategic planning or service planning was being excluded from sizing. And when we add in the cost of that plan for a small agency, that has a significant impact on how much its operating cost goes up in a year, and therefore would increase how much it is eligible to receive with this particular type of change. So you can see how there are changes up and down for other agencies as well here, but would say that we've highlighted the most significant ones here to call out.
Okay. Any questions on this slide? This alternative?
I'll go to D then. And what D shows is all of the above. So we're really looking at what's the cumulative impact of all of these changes. And of all the changes that we made under the previous 3 tweaks that we made, the other 3 alternatives, most of the change that you saw in results was happening as a result of alternative D, in part because that most directly affected sizing, and sizing is how the lion's share of money is allocated. So if these results appear somewhat similar to what you saw under alternative C, that's why they're more similar to that, because that changed sizing, and that made the most significant change in what agencies would receive. So we see a similar note. We're noting similar trends here in terms of some improvements for some agencies, for Fredericksburg and for PRTC, and Central Shenandoah PDC, and some other changes as well. Now, for this particular alternative, because it sort of brings all the changes into one, we've also graphed this one with that quadrant graph. So I'm going to switch to the quadrant graph for this one, unless there are any questions about this particular table for alternative D. So when I switch to the quadrant graph, you're able to see how do agencies change with these changes. And again, what an agency would have received under the previous, what an agency's change would be with the scenario that was presented the last two TSDAC meetings is in black or blue here. And what an agency would receive with all of the changes that we talked about today, all three alternatives compounding on each other, is shown in orange. And so you can see how an agency's changed from what they got the last 3 years on average to what they would get with the new approach, and then with the new approach with these alternatives added to it is what's graphed here. So what I'd note here is that these results are not quite the same as what we looked at when we looked at the first alternative earlier. We see that in the lower quadrant, there are some agencies that gain as a result of these changes, and a couple big ones that see a decline in what they receive. So PRTC is a big beneficiary of these changes, and its allocation goes from about 750,000. Its change in allocation goes from a decline of about 750,000 to a decline of about 300,000. So it sees about a $450,000 gain on average over the 3-year period as a result of this change. Fairfax Connector, on the other hand, it would have seen a decline of about 1.6 million, and its decline increases to about 2 million. So it sees its funding amount decline by about 400,000 because of these changes. And then let me just explain what happens in the upper right quadrant, and then we'll go to questions here. We see some that gain in the upper right quadrant. So CSPDZ, Central Shenandoah, they see that big gain because they're able to count those state-funded planning costs as an operating expense, and their amount goes up in this particular scenario. Lynchburg sees some gains as a result of this, and Richmond sees some gains as a result of this. Two agencies that see some declines as a result of these alternatives are Arlington County's allocation drops by about 100,000, and Hampton Roads Transit's declines by about 200,000. Let me go to questions. Member Matthijs?
Thank you so much. So thank you. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff we're going to need to, these are, all these scenarios, lots of moving parts. Question really comment is a reminder, this is 2 or a year and a half old ridership data. So the trends in the late back to office that we have seen surge in Northern Virginia, we collectively are going to have to re-examine what that looks like, because this is before we had the big surge, right? And so that's fair for me to pause on that, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair comment. I think that's consistent with the some of what we've been trying to remind folks about, is that these new allocations will be based on FY26 data, or that whatever is allocated in FY28 will be based on what people are currently operating today, this fiscal year, from now until July of next year. And therefore, because of especially in Northern Virginia, with some of the significant return to office trends related to the federal government, current shutdown notwithstanding on the impact that has, you will see likely greater ridership, and then that would result in some changes in how this allocates. So all of this, and I think that speaks to the comment that it's best to look at this in terms of how these affect agencies from a policy point of view, as opposed to how they affect any one agency, because agency data trends are shifting for a variety of reasons from year to year.
Sure. Thank you.
Any other questions? Nate, I just wanted to clarify in my own mind. So what happens over time with the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission?
It's kind of it's probably best classified as a quirk of their allocations in the historic 3-year period, because they had a transit plan that was funded by the state that created a one-time blip in their operating expenses. So those costs of that plan were being excluded from their merit allocations for sizing purposes. But under this approach where we're saying we're not going to exclude costs that are part of your operating expenses from your merit allocation for sizing, then you get that bump. And it's a small agency that has a plan that's probably, I don't know what the exact cost of that plan was, but you know, if it's a $100,000 to $200,000 plan that they have in 1 year for a very small agency, that's going to create a bump in their operating cost and then a bump in their funding as a result of having a higher operating cost in 1 year, because operating cost is part of the formula. So if they didn't have that plan, you wouldn't really see any change in their numbers, but it's just kind of an artifice of having that sort of special one-time cost in 1 year.
Right, and so we would expect to see that relative positioning decline over time.
Correct. And it might point to the fact that maybe you do need to take into account certain costs should be excluded because a plan is not just subsidized operations. So that's another potential policy tweak to the definitions.
Right. Presumably the plan is going to help with their efficiency and with their scale.
So
any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to summarize the results of all of this here. So, you know, for the most part, these changes do not meaningfully change allocations for most agencies. So these are things that adjust the allocations for individual agencies. Most notably, scenario C has where we accounted for all costs and sizing as opposed to the excluding costs that were state subsidized. So that really accounts for about 90% of the change in allocations that we see as a result of these tweaks to the scenario that was previously presented, and is really driving the changes that you see in scenario or alternative D, which is what we just had the graph up for. So I think that there is an ability to sort of make some changes in these things from a definitional perspective that could help ameliorate some of the impacts on certain agencies, but yet many of the agencies would not see significant impacts in terms of their allocations as a result of this.
Okay. Questions? Comments? Let me just one more time.
It just is. There's a lot here,
Go right ahead,
so
Kate.
I'm catching up a couple slides late. Did I hear something about an agency's planning money would be counted as operating? How that gets me a little bit thrown off a little bit, or not counted, or I just
that was the case
again.
With
that might be
this,
something to ask offline.
Yeah, that was the case with this one particular data point, the Central Shenandoah PDC, that their total operating cost, which was applied for performance purposes, included everything that the agency had as an operating cost. But for sizing purposes, the cost of this state subsidized plan was excluded. And for the purposes of this scenario here, when we include all costs reported by the agency, including that plan, it results in a bump in funding for that particular agency.
So I think it might be worth a conversation about the operating budget versus, I don't know. Anyway, again, this is kind of a new concept, so it might be worth having some conversations about what that looks like. So if somebody happens to get a grant to support a 50% cost share of their strategic plan from DRPT, that 1 year, is that in the, anyway, so I don't know.
Yeah, I think what this highlighted was a quirk in that data, because of how the cost data is treated. So we didn't make any judgments about should the cost of subsidized services be included or not, depending on whether it was paying for transit service or paying for a plan. We just said these are the costs that are counted for performance purposes. It's the total operating cost of that agency. let's apply that total cost for sizing. But I think this does highlight that maybe there are certain costs that are not operations related that should be excluded. It's not
Definitely
here to make a
worthwhile
judgment on
conversation just
that,
to
but
figure this out.
perhaps as a tweak that would need to be made is in turn, and this particular category of costs is one that's more of a policy change that would be impacted by how it's implemented by DRPT staff in carrying out the program.
I see Jamie, you have a question or a
I would
comment?
just make a comment to follow up on Kate's comment is that we do need to analyze exactly what types of funding, whether it's TRIP grant funding or whether it is related to a transit strategic plan. Depending on the agency, those can be sizable contracts. It's seen as a blip only because it's such a small transit agency that it's impacting. But I think we do need to have further discussion about what should be included and excluded, because smaller agencies will have those blips. The larger agencies will actually end up taking funding from smaller agencies because their TSP is not $100,000 or $200,000, but it's $1 million.
Interesting point. Yeah. Just again, I want to be fairly elementary here and just ask, but all this is contingent on the same total dollar pool ultimately. So it's a question of reallocation, movement among agencies as opposed to a kind of expression of, the relative, one of the challenges, of course, is if every agency is doing a great job, there's not much money to go around, and some agencies that may be meeting our objectives are going to not see any benefit for it if they're not exceeding those benefits of the other agencies or the performance of the other agencies. But that's just a more general cry for more funding.
Mr. Chair, can I weigh in briefly?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Two quick thoughts I wanted to share. First, I want to make sure everyone is mindful that all of these tweaks that we are talking about, including these administrative internal policy definitions that we are analyzing as part of this process, would be using future data and future expenses. So for an FY28 implementation. That being said, secondly, I want to remind you that in the beginning, there's a reason we kind of reminded everyone of roles and responsibilities, and the merit formula and tweaks to the actual formula are within the purview to be advised upon and recommended. What we're talking about now, we're in this really fortunate position where we're meeting with you and we want to be transparent about some of the things we're looking at internally as well. But DRPT makes these type of administrative policy changes on definitions from time to time. And it gets really into the weeds with our transit and our finance team. And so we're happy to be talking about it because it could potentially have an impact, and we want your feedback. I just wanted to make sure to clarify that we're talking about a difference between the formula, which does include the 1 year versus 3 year average on the performance calculation, that scenario A that we went through. The remainder of scenarios are all looking at kind of internal thoughts and administrative policies on definitions that our staff at DRPT has kind of had a light bulb moment during this process, and we might want to take a closer look at. So we thought we'd bring it to you. And we're happy to be having this conversation. It's just a little bit different. It's a little bit separate from the actual formula. So I wanted to just clarify.
Well, thanks for that reminder. Cynthia, I see your hand up.
The director was reading my mind a bit because that's what I wanted to clarify is B, C, and D are not part of the formula merit changes, but what you mentioned early on in your introductory comments, some additional administrative changes to present. And so I appreciate that clarification because if you just read it, it's not as easy to pick up that nuance, that difference. And then based on the summary slide that's before us and the impact or not impact, does DRPT staff have a sense where you're leaning on these more administrative changes to do or not do? Other than there's some refinement, I think, based on that conversation for planning policy pieces that made sense to me, but kind of curious if you were at a place where you knew which way you were going to go.
Well, I'll jump in on behalf of my team, and I hope they will weigh in if anyone feels like there's added commentary or a difference of opinion here. But we've been talking ad nauseum about all of this, as you might imagine, and we are leaning towards, modifying our definitions in some way related to what we're presenting to you. Otherwise, we wouldn't have, taken the time. However, it's really great to have your feedback. And we had some of the same internal conversations about, for example, using cost for performance and cost for sizing like consistently. Does it make sense to really simplify and use the exact same fully built up number of all costs included for both? Or does it make sense to really go through and define individual costs and kind of use a scalpel and have a very detailed definition? We could do either, and that's why we wanted to get your feedback on that today. But we do plan to kind of continue to work on these internal administrative policies while we are with future and updated data that we can run as we are kind of coupling that with the tweaks to the formula changes to make sure that it's as fair across the board as possible.
I appreciate that follow-up. And if I could, Chair, I think it's helpful because I think you will get public comment today and probably during the 45 days on things that are formula-based and administrative. So when we decide to re-meet with TSDAC, let's say that November date that you had out early on, and I know that we were coming back to that point also is when we're going to meet. I would find it helpful to know what, after all these deliberations, your comments, in addition to the formula, what are the things that DRPT is recommending from an administrative policy standpoint? Because going back to the timeline Zach gave me, I assume they're going to all be coalesced together because it's going to change your application, your guidance, your messaging to the transit operators.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, respond to Cindy in particular, because that the purpose of this meeting and the purpose of the following webinar that we will do will absolutely be to be as transparent as we possibly can be and talk about all of this and take feedback on all of this. However, the public comment will be very specific according to code to the formula. So the public comment will be putting out the two proposals, which include on the performance calculation using 1 year of data versus using a 3-year average. And those two proposals for the formula changes will what will be out for public comment.
Well, I guess the point that would be of interest to us, of course, is what those administrative definitions are going to be when those formulas are applied.
Understood. It is a little bit of a work in progress. And so, again, that's why we wanted to show you today what were kind of some of our thoughts and continue to take feedback along the way. And I think the webinar will help us come to a conclusion on that as well.
Right, and I think that just not to speak for everybody on the committee, but just to say that at least from my perspective, this has been very helpful in terms of helping us to understand better what kinds of issues you're wrestling with, and understanding that may have an impact on the nature of the formulas that we're going to consider.
And I think it does, if I may, Chair, I was just going to say it does go back to the earlier conversation about the goals for transparency and simplicity, whether it's the merit formula or how DRPT is administering it. And they're not black and white, right? We've just talked about how they interplay with each other. So I appreciate this discussion as well, Chair, from that perspective. And I think it reinforces for me the importance of being clear for the public comment period, which is the formula, as you said, Director Robinson, and which are being considered, because they do interplay, but they are separate. And I will just, as a closing comment, while I agree that the state code, as we talked about earlier, with my earlier comment, does speak to a lot of the original setup of code, I do think TSDAC still has a role because it talks about redefining any component of the service delivery factors. And I think we are looking at redefining the formula as we go through it. So I do appreciate and want to say thank you to the meetings and the discussion and the sharing of all the input, getting our input and responding as one can see. And I still recommend at the end of this time, before it goes to the CTB, that there is a recommendation from the TSDAC if we can get to a consensus. So the chair has the backing of us as he speaks to the CTB with the DRPT director. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? I think we're at the open discussion portion of the agenda, and I think we've had a lot of open discussion here. All right. If not, then let's go on to next steps.
I'll jump in for this slide, Mr. Chair. I think we already mentioned that we plan to release both proposals for public comment, including the 1 year of data for the performance calculation and the 3-year average of data, so that we can receive comment on both versions. And next, I mentioned in the beginning that we inadvertently left this off the slide, but we are going to do a webinar in late October. So the date for that is being formulated right now, and we'll have that out and post it publicly and kind of shoot out lots of information about that so everybody knows where to jump on. And we are excited about that because I do think it gives another important opportunity for the public and for all transit agencies to come together all at once, which we haven't had the opportunity to do yet, and understand the changes and ask any additional questions and provide feedback. And then I guess the final thing that we talked about again in the beginning is when and how we come back together. The TSDAC will need to come back to have an opportunity to take a formal position on these proposals. And we are open to your feedback on whether or not, as I mentioned earlier, we would try to schedule a TSDAC meeting, last week of October, early November after the webinar, or if you would like to have the benefit of all the public comments and do it at the very end of November or the first week of December. We're totally open. We do know that most of the time, the vast majority of public comment comes in the early weeks of an open period. And there's less at the end. And we know the holidays are coming. That's the only reason we wanted to give this group kind of both options and to have a discussion about that. And based on your consensus, we will do a poll and try to bring everyone back together so you can take a formal position at your convenience.
Okay, so you're suggesting that the choices are between an October or November, late October, early November meeting, or a late November, early December meeting?
That's right. The public comment period will end November 21st. So the problem is that following week is the week of Thanksgiving. So, we could shoot for that Monday, or we could look to the first couple of days of December, the following week, as options. And of course, we would work with the whole group to make sure we could work with everybody's schedules.
Okay. See a hand up.
So, Mr. Chair, just Director Robinson, is there a date already for the December CTB meeting? Just sort of helps in terms of if we have a TSDAC meeting, how close we put it to provide what you guys need for CTB?
I believe the meeting is scheduled for December 9th, but I'm looking to double check myself.
Okay. That's helpful.
Dr. Smoot might know. Am I right on that December 9th date?
What day of the week is that?
Should be a Tuesday usually, right?
Stephanie? Yeah, I think that is correct.
Okay. So that, I guess that's important for us to, that sort of eyes are on that, what you are presenting to CTB at that December 9th.
Yeah.
And that will include anything from TSDAC, right? As well as the public comment and anything that reflects public comment changes, correct?
That's right. And I did just double check. It is, in fact, scheduled for December 9th.
Fantastic. The second question, to just be indulged, only because I was losing, we saw ABCD options. You mentioned 2 proposals being shared for public comment. Can you just confirm of the ABCD, like, hey, just help what's going on for public comment?
100%. And I'm going to flip it back to Nate to maybe show you this, but the public comment formula will essentially be the base scenario that we prepared, plus the scenario with option A, which now includes a 3-year average of data in the formula, in the performance formula.
So
Nate,
what
do you want to
happens to
elaborate
B,
on
C,
that?
and D?
Sorry, what was your question, Kate?
What happens to B, C, and D? Are we commenting on them, or?
You are commenting and providing us valuable feedback right now and during the webinar period of time, and of course, any time along the way. But the internal policy definitions and technical guidance are not subject to CTV approval or TSDAC review. Those are within the authority of DRPT.
So things that actually affect how much money folks get is still within the power of DRPT.
As the administrators of the program, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Cindy?
Thank you. I was going to say that my preference is after the public input so that we can benefit from that. That said, I realize that makes it really tight with Thanksgiving and the CTB meeting, but it's still my preference. One, for the timing of the public hearing period, but also that gets us through the VML conference and the VACO conference. So for the chair and the vice chair who is representing those organizations, I would like to make sure that I'm hearing for the full membership, and the transit operators, parts of those groups will definitely be part of the webinar, but we also need to hear from the governing bodies who budget and have policy impact. So it gets really tight, but I think that's important. And I don't know when VTA and everybody else might be able to be meeting and hearing from their folks, but I know they'll all be engaged in public comment. Plus, then we want to be able to absorb that. So challenging as that is, that's my recommendation, is after the 21st or as close to that 21st cutoff date.
Okay. Any other comments now, or should we just wait till we get an availability survey, or do you want to have a sense of preference right now?
Mr. Chair, I think getting a sense sounds to me like, from what I've heard, that the group would prefer to have the benefit of all the public comment. So we can do that. If anybody feels otherwise, I'm happy to take that into consideration and hear that now. And I also wanted to, I'm thinking about my words, and I want to clarify something I said before. The administrative changes that we are looking at, we will include in the calculations. I'm trying to make sure I say this right, because it's so complex. When we present the formulas for public comment, that will include 1 year of data and 3 years of data. It's a little bit different than our meetings where we've prepared scenario after scenario to show you. But we certainly could, talk about the calculations and the definitions that we plan to use in the formula, including those administrative policies. I'm thinking that that might be helpful for the group to make sure that they understand the different definitions that we're using and putting out to the public for comment. So if that's helpful, it's certainly within, our prerogative to include that. And it might be helpful during the webinar and during the public comment period so that you guys have the full benefit of all the feedback when we come back in November, December.
Right. I think you're absolutely right about that, and appreciate your bringing that forward, because I think it's undoubtedly the case that some of the comment that people may want to make is on some of these aspects of the formula, which will be determined by the staff, but where it could still be the case that somebody would draw attention to something that they think will be a great benefit or a real detriment in terms of some of those administrative determinations that are going to be made. So again, I recognize that we're not making the recommendation on those changes per se, but but it is something that you would want to get some opportunity for feedback that might be useful for you in making the final determination. That's the whole point of the public comment, I would think.
We can certainly do that.
Great. Okay. Anything else? We are now at the last page of the presentation. I think we've had our open discussion, unless anyone else would like to make any comments or address something that we haven't had a chance to consider.
Chair, do we need to have public comment this meeting, item number 5?
Yes, I think we do. If
Okay.
there is anybody who's waiting. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to close that open discussion.
Okay.
And so, hearing no objection to moving on, then we'll move on to the public comment. Do we have any speakers today?
I
Bob
see
Schneider
one
with,
hand raised.
oh,
I'm sorry?
We do have Bob Schneider, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Bob Snyder. Mr. Snyder?
thank you so much. I appreciate that. So a couple of comments. First and foremost, I really do appreciate how much work has gone into this from the DRPT staff, the consultants. So you can tell that they're looking at a lot of different things from different angles. And I think the uniqueness of some of the things we learned today, for example, I'm trying to think back to when I was managing a small agency in which suddenly I would get an influx of cash that I couldn't use on renewable services, which meant therefore I would be harmed in the formula, which means 3 years from now I'm losing money because I got money. And so those are the kinds of things that the ability to pull on and put back together and look at things like, I've been harping on this for a while, fare collection. OmniRide uses state funds to run services on behalf of the state, but we don't use money to receive zero fare product. Other agencies around the state use DRPT funds to raise use zero fare product to spike their ridership, which is great, by the way, because we want utilization. But there's a lot of those things. So looking at how much work DRPT has been able to do and really look at those things, I would just encourage giving them lots more time to do it, because each time they go through the process, it becomes more nuanced, and TSDAC is able to ask great questions. And yes, it might be a little bit time consuming, but that iterative process is what makes public policy work for a state that is as diverse as Virginia is. And I'm not just talking from a Northern Virginia perspective, but what is this going to mean to Shenandoah Valley? What might this mean in Bristol? And so those are some of the things that I would look to, and I encourage giving the space and the time to let the talented staff at DRPT and HDR to continue to do the work. Thank you, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Appreciate that. Any other comments? Do we have anybody else signed up for comment? It appears not.
That's it. That's it. This is Zach. I've confirmed there's no one else to sign up for public comment.
Okay, great. All right. So then we will just, we've already gone through, I think, next steps, unless anybody needs any clarification on that. I'm not hearing anyone. And so, Director Robinson, if you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
Just thank you again. Thank you for all your time and for all your feedback. And we will make sure that all of the members have the information about the upcoming webinar. And then we will send a poll out for our future meeting.
Thank you very much. And I once again appreciate all the effort that we've seen put into this and the incredible work both of our staff, of DRPT staff, and of the consultants team, which have given us an awful lot to think about and have been very responsive to concerns and questions that have arisen or opportunities that might be out there. So thank you again for all of that. I will simply ask if there's anything else to come before us, and I'll give it a quick 10 count in my head. And hearing nothing, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstention? Thank you all very much. We'll see you in November, December, no, November probably.
Thanks all.